Welcome to the Komodo seminar on the Endpoint Protection Problem Revisited, the Analyst View. The endpoint problem has been revisited multiple times over the last 3 decades with multiple new technologies. This webinar gathers 3 industry experts to revisit the endpoint protection problem. Each will take their turn today. First, you will hear from Dr. Kenneth Gears. Kenneth is a NATO Cybersecurity Ambassador, an Atlantic Council Senior Fellow, and a TSM University of Kiev visiting professor. His experience spans the US government, NSA, NCIS, and NATO. He is also the author of Strategic Cybersecurity, edited Cyber War and Perspective, and also editor of The Virtual Battlefield. Dr. Gears will cover the nature of the global threat based on some great threat intelligence from Komodo. Then we will hear from Fernando Montenegro. Fernando is a senior analyst at 451 Research. With broad experience in security architecture, he currently focuses on the endpoint security and cloud security spaces. Prior to 451, Fernando was hands-on with the security at companies including vArmor, RSA, Silvertie, Crossbeam, and Hewlett-Packard. He holds a BSc in computer science and multiple industry certifications. Fernando will cover the technologies and players in endpoint security today and discuss what we should be preparing for as future endpoint protection. Finally, we will be Marco Coulter. That's me. I combine 2 years of industry experience in systems management from mainframe to endpoint with 5 years as an industry analyst prior to joining Komodo. Based on field experiences here at Komodo, I will recommend key best practices for comparing and deploying endpoint protection technologies. Okay, a value-packed session coming up. With that, let me now cross over to our first speaker, Dr. Gears. Kenneth?
Hello. So thank you so much for the introduction. My background is largely in government, but as an analyst, I've been in the cybersecurity, or is in the government used to be, well, we'd call it signals intelligence, and now cybersecurity is a part of it, really. But since 1993, and so I've had a chance to be on offense, defense, and special teams, I think, of this space, largely at NSA and then NCIS, like the TV show, and NATO internationally. And when I look at cybersecurity, basically, I look at what has happened in the real world. So next slide, please. Here's some of the events that I've been associated with. When I was at DoD around the year 2000, we had a bomb hit a Navy ship in Yemen, and when we thought about how then to protect the ship, it was very interesting, because what we saw was that there was much more to security. So some of it's cyber, some of it is telecommunications running from and through the ship, where it goes in the world, cyber cafes, games. It was just layer upon layer of challenge, basically. Here's some other things I looked at. For example, the F-35 over the years, if you can see, it doesn't look like a joystick, it looks like an iPad with so many processors and network connections. In Estonia in 2007, Ukraine in 2014, I've written on these subjects and analyzed them in depth. And basically, what we see is that the threat is ubiquitous, and it's growing. It's all around us, and it requires a professional, focused effort. Next slide, please. So here's Komodo data, and this gives you some idea of the scope, the quantity, or the amount of malware that we're swimming in, basically. And here you have ranked from top to bottom, sort of Russia, US this week, or the top places where Komodo has detected malware, and something like 25 different kinds of malware. And all the way, there's only 2 countries. Komodo's been around for a long time, so we really have good visibility, and what we can do what's called strategic or longitudinal analysis across the planet in order to see, which countries are most targeted, but also which verticals within them. And then across countries, whether it's healthcare, education, etc., we can see kind of where the attackers are going. For example, we can see in 2017, ransomware moving from the beginning of the year from Russia through Iran into Poland and eventually over to the United States by May. So cyber defense analysis is a bit tricky because the attribution problem, frankly, is the single most vexing issue in cybersecurity, because if you don't know who's attacking you, basically deterrence is hard, retaliation is hard, prosecution is difficult. So there were many cases in the 90s in which we thought at DoD that it was a nation state, and it wound up being a teenager, in one case in California, in another case in Montreal. But basically, false flagging, for example, is a big issue. And a lot of times, sophisticated players, they're only going to do what they have to get into your network. And so that will look like freely available malware that they can download. And if it does the trick, that's fine. Malware reuse, for example, stealing other people's code and repurposing it is a common problem. And so for cyber defense analysis, really what you need is expertise focused on a problem over a long period of time. Time is often an analyst's best friend. So Albert Einstein said, we have time so that not everything happens all at once. But here you can see that when you see these crests of malware activity, then we can dig into them and we can see, for example, just this week, Armenia had a massive avalanche of Trojans. And we can see that by putting things on a timeline, and then you can click on this and see which countries, which types of malware, and which verticals are targeted. And sometimes there's no other way to do it but then to use time as your friend, because basically if you associate real-world events with network events, again, you can see that there's usually a reason for especially major malware outbreaks. So here we have the sorted by the top malware type per country over just this past week. And you can see already there are some patterns that emerge, such as a richer north versus a poorer south. When you have worms and viruses as your top malware category, it's likely that you have more pirated software, unlicensed, or unmanaged software. And so what that does at Komodo is help us to tailor cybersecurity solutions to unique or local environments. Here's the ratio within countries, and you can see that, for example, Trojans dominated in Poland and Ukraine, but if you look at Russia, they have a very complex data set. In Taiwan, a particular problem with viruses. Worms have been common in Canada this year. And so every country, enterprise, has a unique malware profile that really can help cyber defenders to understand threat actors and campaigns and the overall nature of the threat they're dealing with. Here's the United States, and you can see for cities and states, they do have, within countries, you're going to find less difference. But when you sort it by city or state, you can see campaigns arise that have targeted particular networks or particular vulnerabilities that existed within, let's say, healthcare, education, aviation, critical infrastructure, things that that just made them vulnerable for a period of time. But then it's possible to disassemble, reverse engineer attacks, classify them, and then to do better next time. Here's a look at verticals, and two things I just want to take away, you to take away from this slide are that Trojans are everywhere. They're our most common malware type that we see. They're within every vertical. So that's on the right. In the middle, you can see our primary malware types, backdoor, virus, etc., that we detect here at Komodo. And you can see that technology is a recipient of so many actors and campaigns in the malware space. And what that means is a little bit like what the military calls a force multiplier. Like when the Chinese about 10 years ago really wanted to go after dissidents within the in the human rights space, they didn't go after one Gmail account, they went after Google, right? So the same thing in 2014, there was some attacks from the Syrian Electronic Army, and they targeted basically a range of online communications websites. And what they wanted to do there is not hit one user, but potentially thousands. So over the course of just a couple of weeks in 2014, the SEA took over something like 1 billion online accounts. And so the point is very, very quickly, cybersecurity can become very personal. Here's a wheel that shows the top 6 countries for last week. And what I've added here is the family. So for every country, you can say, here's our primary malware type, but then one layer deeper, here's the family that we're dealing with. For example, Brazil and Taiwan both had virus as their top malware category, but because they're in very different geographical places on the globe, they each have a different malware family to deal with. This is very valuable. This is not data, this is not information, this is intelligence of high value, what's called actionable intelligence. And you can really do something with this, because then you can understand the type of threat actor and the type of code that you need to take care of. Again, back to a timeline, cyber attacks do not happen in a vacuum. Cyberspace is just a reflection of traditional human affairs. So if you drop malware campaigns, spikes in overall detections onto a timeline, I can't guarantee you that these things are directly related. But a good example for you can look on January 1st, where it says the bomb, you may remember, killed nearly 40 people in Istanbul, in Turkey. Now, as an analyst, what I see here is this could be local law enforcement actions, domestic or international intelligence, cyber criminals taking advantage of the situation. It could be a wide range of actors and campaigns, but largely what you're looking at probably is a lot of cyber espionage from various corners of the globe, and they're using malware infrastructure, they're leveraging it to gain information. And so there are basically direct parallels between real-world activity and cyber activity. And if you don't believe me, just drop it on a timeline and you can see. And if you look at it from the right perspective, you'll see the relationship. So this is my final slide. And what I want you to think about is over the course of time, cyber attacks are getting no less complicated. They're only getting more ubiquitous and more intimate, right? As we all become, in effect, cyborgs. If you go to a party now and you look in the corner, you're liable to see a range of people staring at their cell phones. And what they're doing is they're living in cyberspace, and eventually that'll be piped directly into their brain. But the difference, for example, between Estonia 2007 and Ukraine today in terms of cyber attacks is diversity. Ubiquity and intimacy. In Ukraine, every economic sector has been hit, and every important network has been compromised at some time during the conflict. So thank you. That's my presentation. I'm happy to entertain any questions either today or via email after.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. It's fantastic to get a global perspective. I guess one internet, one world, right?
That's correct.
Now for our second speaker. 451 Research is a top 5 IT analyst research company, and I'd like to introduce Fernando Montenegro, a senior analyst from 451 Research, to discuss endpoint security threats. Fernando.
Thank you very much, Marco, and thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time. I know that it's you have a busy day, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. I'm going to take this conversation on a slightly different direction. So Kenneth looked over at the macro trends affecting us. I want to look at the market. I want to look at where it is that we're coming from, what are the kind of things that we're seeing. So my agenda is we'll take a quick look at the market. I want to review some of the typical use cases that we see for endpoint security nowadays. I also want to tackle a couple of buzzwords. I think that that's an interesting aspect, and I am kind of stealing my own thunder by listing the buzzwords I'm going to talk about. But I think that it sets us up. That's okay. We'll take a look at an approach that we see for endpoint, and then we'll discuss what we see in terms of trends. So let's talk about the endpoint market, right? The endpoint market is incredibly busy, and the endpoint market, there's two sides to it. On the first side, we have to understand what it is that we see in terms of the demand side. So the data that we're seeing here comes from 451's Voice of the Enterprise surveys, and these are high quality surveys we do with senior management and IT teams across the world. And what I picked out here is for a recent survey we did, this is the breakdown in the organization makeup in terms of employees overall. And what I want you to see here is that there is a significant number of small organizations. Doesn't mean necessarily they have small IT needs, doesn't mean that they are small, they don't have assets under management or something like that, but just that there are smaller organizations. So that when you think about this, you have to consider that a lot of the market out there are organizations that are not very large, don't have that much capacity, and they're looking for solutions. So who is providing solutions to these companies? And there are literally hundreds of vendors in the endpoint security space. I like to break them down in sectors. So first of all, as we see here, we have what we call the traditional enterprise vendors, right? This is the likes of Symantec, McAfee, Intel, Trend, Sophos, Kaspersky's. They've been around for a while. They have different vendors. They have different offerings. You also have organizations that are coming from what I call the beyond consumer. These are organizations that had a very good presence in the consumer space and now moving a little bit more into the enterprise space, Bitdefender, Avast, and others. And they all behave a little bit differently. Next, you have the next gen, or we call the upstarts. These are the companies that have, over the past few years, kind of adopted better, more sophisticated analytical approaches to things and are looking to displace the existing existing enterprise. They're looking to be the choice for enterprise vendors all around, for enterprise customers all around. And this is where we see, for example, Komodo fitting in. This is where we see Carbon Black and Cylance and things like that. Next, we also have the space is also contested by a number of other enterprise vendors. I come from a network security background, so these names are common to me from other markets. But we see Cisco, Palo Alto, Checkpoint, and Fortinet all having endpoint offerings. I also threw in here Microsoft and IBM just because they also approach endpoint security slightly differently. And then there is a tremendous number of smaller organizations focusing on specific points of the endpoint problem. You have some virtualization, you have some remote isolation, etc. So once we understand, so there's a smattering of companies offering solutions. And there's a smattering of customers looking for solutions. What are customers actually looking for? Let's take a look. This again comes from our Voice of the Enterprise data. And what I want you to see here is that there's two things that I think are interesting. First of all, these are the different use cases, and this is the data that we asked last year and then this year about how satisfied customers are. And there's two things I want you to take a look at here. First of all, is that it's a good breakdown of the use cases for an endpoint solution, from detecting known malware, understanding and preventing that malware, all the way down to doing application whitelisting or threat hunting, etc. And what I want you to see is that there are different levels of satisfactions in each. So for example, detecting known malware, it's between 4 or last year 4.1 this year, but something like detecting unknown malware, it's still 2.9. And preventing unknown malware is even less at 2.8. So there is a variation in satisfaction. The other thing I want you to be aware of is that there is a significant improvement in every single category year to year. What this tells us is that the market is highly competitive and that there is tremendous innovation happening across the board, across vendors, in terms of adopting new techniques, new things to look at to address these problems. Leading people to a conclusion that I think it's important is you shouldn't sit on your existing solution that's for years just because it's what you used for years. There is innovation in the market and we should look at it. Now, how does that innovation get deployed to customers? It gets deployed with a number of endpoint agents, right? And we've all seen and we all heard of the pain that endpoint agents have. And the thing I want to call out here is that, again, vote data, we asked how many endpoint agents there are. I want you to realize that we see two things. First of all, that there is some organizations that have upwards of six, some at 20, really. But most organizations fall on a below 5 agents. The other thing I want you to call out, and this is something I highlighted in the slide, just click please, is that the number of organizations that are saying we are deploying one single agent has grown significantly year over year. I think that this is an important fact because it tells you kind of what the struggles that people have and how vendors are trying to meet that demand with smaller number of agent solutions. So with that in mind, let's switch over to our buzzword piece, which I find interesting. Now, buzzword number one I wanted to tackle is big data. Big data is something that we have huge amounts of data. I added here, we have a very large number of events from places that give us unique visibility. And what I want to do with these buzzwords is I want to help people understand that what they actually mean. And in this case, what it actually means is, yes, there is significant data available from a vendor's existing deployment somewhere else, or they are collecting that information with partners, and they are using that in two ways. Either they are using that as data collection for deeper analytics, which leads to my buzzword number two, we'll get there in a second, or it's about achieving herd immunity. And herd immunity is a term that refers to the fact that if I found something bad and I uploaded it to my central repository, and then every other endpoint in the world is able to download that information, whenever that something bad happens on their end, then they're going to be already protected. Right, and I find it interesting that there is some confusion, especially when you hear vendors discuss discuss big data, because sometimes they're referring to big data on the analytics side, and sometimes they're referring to big data, this herd immunity side. The thing, the herd immunity, I find it very interesting. It's something that you can potentially integrate different data sources and so on. As far as analytics is concerned, it's also extremely valuable. But there is one key point when you're talking about big data in the context of analytics, which is quantity is not equals to quality. It doesn't matter if you have 5 billion data points. If you can't process those 5 billion data points with your machine learning pipeline, it's just taking up disk space. Which brings us to buzzword number two. Artificial intelligence and machine learning. And the examples you see from vendors in many, yeah, we use machine learning for unknown cyber threats, or we use behavior analytics and machine learning advanced. The way I see it happening, and as an analyst, I interface with vendors and enterprise customers all the time. What I see happening is that there is a hope that we are going to have, that machine learning is going to be the answer to solve everything. Like, I don't know what's going on, but machine learning is going to solve it. I don't know what's going to, we use advanced machine learning. And the point I want to make here is that, yes, it is very interesting mathematics. It does solve problems, and it has enabled us to do fantastic things, but it's not the cure-all, be-all, end-all. And the other thing I find about machine learning that people should be aware of is that as I say in the slide, it's incredibly difficult for a customer evaluating a solution to evaluate the quality of that vendor's machine learning implementation. There are different, the quote kind of jumped ahead, I apologize, but there's different technical elements of analyzing machine learning models. You have confusion matrices, ROC curves, etc. They are very useful for someone who's developing a machine learning pipeline, but they are not useful for a customer who's going to be consuming that pipeline or has to compare that pipeline with another vendors. So I find machine learning still to be the significant buzzword of recent dates. And as Arthur C. Clarke said, I mean, it's almost magic, right? Any insufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, we should peel off the layers and understand that a little better. Just moving on, buzzword number 3 I wanted to talk on was threat hunting. And threat hunting is, yeah, we're going to threat hunt at scale. We're going to give you capabilities to do threat hunting. And I find it's an incredibly powerful set of tooling that allows for very detailed, very fine-grained investigations into incidents within an environment. The thing that I put it in the buzzword category is that it's a very interesting capability, but from our experience, from talking to our enterprise customers, from talking to vendors, etc., that's not the reality for the significant majority of operations. I hate to be the one to bring up the recent incidents at Equifax or Deloitte or Whole Foods or whatnot, but in virtually all of those cases, it's not a failure to threat hunt that led to that. It's a failure to do the basics, right? So threat hunting becomes, as if someone at 451 mentioned that the expression, the security 1%, right? It's the organizations who have almost infinite budgets. We're not all like that. And I put threat hunting in the buzzword category because it is being sold, yes, you should be doing threat hunting. Let's take a step back here. You should be doing security properly. That may or may not involve threat hunting. Next, please. So based on what we've looked at, what does the endpoint environment looks like in terms of if you're going to secure an endpoint? We are coming across having very well-defined stages, right? So stage number 1 is you should have some level of prevention, which means you're trying to avoid contact with malware or exploits or what have you. And there's different ways you can do this. As it says on the slide, you can do content filtering. Perhaps you have application control that doesn't allow applications to run in the first place. Perhaps you have good device control for USB devices. I throw in here cheap lookup of file hashes, almost as a prevention technique. After that, you move on to protection. So you have something executing on your environment, or as it's about to execute, then you do some pre-execution checking. This is where the machine learning is going to come into play. This is where you might check against an existing database. Remember the herd immunity I mentioned earlier might come in. This is where you might want to detonate it in the sandbox for a couple of minutes and see if it's going to run or not. And within the protection phase, there's a couple of interesting approaches. If you're still not sure about how you're going to do that, about that particular artifact, you might consider isolation. You know what? Let's run it as a virtualized, either a full virtualized VM, but that's sometimes a little too heavy, or you might want to run it as a more granular virtualized platform. Or you might want to, you know what? I'm going to run it completely outside of my environment. This is a remote execution. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 then becomes detection. Something is running. Do we have any evidence of malicious behavior? Is it trying to do system calls it's not supposed to? Is it trying to do behaviors that we know to be associated with malware? And this is the kind of technology tooling that fits into it, the host-based intrusion prevention, the application behavior, and so on. I would add that when you can detect things by doing some sort of remote targeted investigation. You're looking at you're searching your environment for indicators of compromise you downloaded from a threat intel feed. You're looking at timelines. Those would also almost fall into the detection phase as well. And then finally, you have response. That response is going to be either an automated response, which is the holy grail kind of thing, or it's going to be more of an ad hoc remote response. You're going to execute tooling. You're going to execute commands across your environment. Block this particular hash across my environment. I don't care who has it or not. Remove that file and so on. Some tools have the capability to do rollback, especially for ransomware. It's a common it's something that we see. The jury is still out about how successful rollbacks actually are, but they are there. And this is the domain of endpoint detection and response, the EDR tooling. Moving on, just wrapping up, what do we have then in terms of trends that we are seeing happening now and that we expect to see in the near future? First of all, around the threat landscape. Ransomware remains with us. I have a passion for economics, and I like to think about the economics of ransomware as being particularly interesting. Sad, but interesting. So ransomware is going to remain with us for a long time. Lateral movement is going to remain a significant tactic for a more aggressive attacker. But what I wanted to just wrap up on the threat landscape is that I think we'll see the increased incidence of fileless malware, and we've been dealing with PowerShell and WMI issues on Windows for a while now. I think that the next frontier is going to be the Linux subsystem and how people exploit some of that. To answer those questions and to move forward, I think that we are seeing Microsoft take a more aggressive approach in terms of improved operating system controls. They see the need for, I mean, it would be the Windows S, right? It's pretty much the curation model that Apple did. You can only run specific applications, application whitelisting. But even before that, I think that we see Microsoft pushing to have more improved controls in the operating system to address some of these problems. We are going to see behavior analytics as a key component, and in pretty much every solution, whether that is to do analytics of how applications are behaving or moving on to how users themselves are behaving. And then finally, I think, next slide, we're going to see, but then this is a key point, we are going to continue seeing an adoption of ways to make the endpoint deployment more efficient. That's going to be both in terms of, we see a number of vendors adopting a cloud-based management approach. In other words, you start to use more endpoint management in the cloud. And then like I mentioned before, that number that's very striking is we are seeing a reduction in the number of endpoint agents. That's absolutely a fact. People want to consolidate as much as possible. On that note, I thank you very much for your time, and now I'll pass it over to Marco.
Thank you, Fernando. It's amazing how the endpoint landscape is constantly changing. I'm your next speaker. I bring experience from living in 3 countries and working with multiple technologies, and I want to offer some of the best practices that our field has identified in endpoint protection. So today I'm going to cover 3 specific areas where there is a clear differentiation in endpoint protection and make some recommendations. So let's start with one that has been an ongoing battle since the birth of IT security. Something that security experts have struggled with for decades is finding the balance between security and protection. Imagine if you built a concrete bunker around your house and it had no doors or windows. Now your house is secure, but of course your productivity is down because you can't access the home. The other way is to imagine your house with no locks on any of the doors or windows. Now your house is productive, but completely insecure. So you end up, we have as a society, ended up as creating a balance of the productivity of doors and windows, but with the security of locks and fences and sort of layers around the house. As you know, enterprises have struggled with this balance for years, but some new technologies are allowing us to change how we address these things. So let's look at these in a little more detail quickly. Security professionals have always sought to deliver the tightest security by locking out everything that is not absolutely safe. This is the default deny approach, right? Security would love to set default deny on the endpoint. We would. That would mean that no unknown files or software can make it to the endpoint, and no websites, new websites at least, can be accessed, and nothing new means no risk, right? However, unless you've worked in specific defense locations, you will never have experienced default deny. Why? Because the business won't stand for the negative productivity impact. Unknown files are where the real threat lies. The next zero-day attack begins as an unknown file. But the challenge is that from Komodo's threat intelligence, they see millions of new unknown files each week. The business challenge with default deny is that 93.1% of those unknowns are good. They're good files. They're useful. They're supporting the business. So default deny would block all of them. They'll block that new $1 million contract from your new client. It blocks the software update that supports your new product. Whatever it is, this is why you don't see default deny, this traditional default deny in effect, in use, except maybe in nuclear missile bunkers or somewhere like that. So if option 1 is no good, what about option 2? Option 2, well, for a long time, the only other option to default deny was default allow. This approach was said to block known bad files, but any unknown file was allowed to execute. The business could now happily receive new contracts and documents without delay. Software upgrades were installed cleanly in time to support newly released products. The business was agile, so everything is great, right? Well, hold on a minute. If you remember those numbers from the prior slide, the 90% number, well, the other half of that number is that an average of 6.9% of the millions of new unknown files seen each week are malware. So default allow leads to the headlines we read about that Fernando was just mentioning about ransomware and hospital surgeries having to close down and until computers can be recovered and cleaned. So option 2, a standard of traditional antivirus vendors, has failed us for decades. And that's why we still see headlines about infections all the time. The good news is there's a third option. So the key here in terms of best practice is to go with option 3, default deny security plus default allow productivity. So don't assume that default deny or default allow are your only choices. New technologies mean new choices. For decades, vendors have chased better detection as the solution to infections, hoping that eventually with heuristics and machine learning and behavioral analysis and whatever is next, they could one day maybe get to 100% detection. They were chasing the wrong problem. All these detection technologies are useful, but you'll always have to handle new unknown files. So once you have containment or application isolation, detection technology only just needs to be good enough now. The introduction of isolation technologies like containment support this third option, a default deny security with default allow productivity. You can let the unknown file through to run on the endpoint so you get the highest productivity. And while the executable is unknown, it's running inside a container that protects against infection on the endpoint. So you avoid all the infections and you're getting the highest security. So the action here is to understand containment, understand how it changes the endpoint protection game. Once you accept that there will always be new unknown files, then detection technologies become less relevant. It no longer matters whether an antivirus scanner is 99.1% effective or 99.6% effective. Machine learning becomes an efficiency measure rather than, for detection rather than a security measure for protection. Containment and application isolation have really changed the endpoint protection game. understanding containment is a product evaluation best practice. The next best practice is an architectural one. If we look at laying security, it's nothing new in humanity. In medieval times, we had moats as well as castle walls. IT security is the same. We have boundary technologies to protect our enterprises against the outside world. They're filtering email, our web browsing, IP traffic, protecting against distributed denial of service attacks. But of course, not every attack comes from the outside. So we need to protect our internal networks, looking for IAM anomalies, looking for network traffic anomalies, and so on, and events even in database and web server logs. And as we've been discussing today, we also need endpoint security as a layer. The mistake is to think of endpoint security as a single layer. So let's drill into endpoint for a second. Protecting the endpoint is complex, and you've seen some of, you've heard Fernando talking about the technologies, you've heard Kenneth talking about the threats. Protecting it is complex, and the user sitting in front of the endpoint is normally not a cybersecurity expert. So you have to help protect them against their own naivete. On the endpoint, there are three categories of layers: prevention, protection, and detection. Prevention is a fairly new one. If we look at prevention first, it includes layers like personal firewalls, URL filtering to stop hitting bad websites, patch management to make sure that the underlying operating systems and applications have the latest maintenance installed. You're looking at things like HIPS and of course, device control to stop that person picking up a free USB stick at a conference and bringing it back inside your enterprise, thus avoiding all the boundary and network layers you might have put in place. You've also got the detection layers, still, things like antivirus, still very efficient for spotting known good and bad files. You've got file intelligence that can use vendor lists to identify new good files and flag them as good to avoid, losing productivity. You've got behavioral and sandbox analysis going on. And by the way, sandbox analysis, in my opinion, should always be cloud-based. You don't want this sort of analysis, and I'll talk about machine learning in the same way. You don't want the workload on your endpoints. You want the workload on somebody else's machine if you can make it happen that way. Protection arrived, just a few years ago with application isolation, or containment as it's known. Before this, you were preventing known bad and trying to detect within the unknowns, and then hoping that nothing would fall through the cracks. Now there is a final layer of protection. It would not be efficient, but you could turn off all the other layers and just run everything in containment and be protected. But as a security professional, you want to know that there are layers of security even down here on the endpoint. So architecturally, the best practice for the endpoint is the same as for your entire enterprise. Make sure there are layers of security. Most vendors offer multiple different technologies within an endpoint protection product. And if they don't, you should probably skip them because it means you're going to have to integrate those layers yourself. Fernando is talking exactly about the number of agents and different things that can pile up if you apply too many different vendor technologies. Most vendors are offering, to sort out the product. So what you need to do is sort out the product's layers. You want to make sure that you're getting multiples for prevention, multiples for detection. Remember that they're really just efficiency layers, ensuring that only the definitely new, definitely unknown files get to run in containment isolation. Even the most efficient containment isolation will have a tiny overhead to it, so it's more efficient to detect and prevent before you hit isolation, before you hit containment. But the real story here is to acknowledge and accept that unknown files are where infections come from. The action here is to examine how unknown files are treated in your enterprise. Does the life cycle allow immediate business access while preventing infection, or is it locking unknown files away from your end users while you're trying to sort out a verdict, waiting for a security professional to make the choice? The next best practice goes a little more technical, a little more deeper. It's about differentiating, I guess it's a best practice about differentiating between endpoint protection products. So you've got to look at where and when certain things happen. So how an endpoint product treats a file can make the difference between a thriving business and an Equifax. Known good files are easy. We know they are good and they are allowed to execute. No need for a verdict or container. Known bad files are also easy. Block them from running altogether, delete them. Now we accept that unknown files are the source of infections and attacks, it's important to get a verdict on every file to get them out of that unknown state. There are 3 choices for where unknown file can execute while seeking a verdict. And spoiler alert, the contained result is going to be the recommendation here. Some vendors choose to hold onto the file in pre-execution. So they're sort of holding it somewhere, running it perhaps in a sandbox in their situation. You've got no idea, possibly no idea the file even exists, or you can't access the file because it's being pre-execution tested. I'm not a huge fan of that. Going to the other extreme is post-execution. I sort of laugh at this a little bit, but this is like, let the file execute uninhibited, and if it turns out that it's a bad file and it turns out you've been infected, then hope that the software will have tracked everything that changed and will somehow be able to clean up that post-infection. And that's why, you know, I put the big splat on the graphic here and the little clock to say, well, you've got to wait until, you know, it's running, you're infected, and then you're waiting for that verdict to come back, and then you don't know if it's actually going to clean up or not, or how the infection has spread. Containment takes a different approach. By running the unknown file in a container, you're able to access it immediately. You know the file exists. You're using the file. But the container is protecting your environment. It's preventing the infection from taking hold. It confuses the infection into thinking it's running in the real world when, in fact, it's running inside a container. So if we look at it from a slightly different perspective of just, you know, the contained while waiting for verdict is the best approach here. You get the productivity of default allow usability and the protection of default deny security. So my next little rant is to talk about where things happen. We talk about, you know, Fernando was talking about machine learning, and you know, everybody seems to be losing their mind about this technology. Look, it's really cool technology. I've loved training modules myself and teaching, you know, my software to look for daffodils and see it in photos. And it has some benefits. It can predict based on new input data, which, you know, regular programming cannot do. The con is that it tends to be inconclusive. It's a best guess technology. Essentially, it searches for through available functions for the most applicable function that gives us the best result. The training here is load intensive, so you definitely want to keep the training away from production and user workloads. So training should happen sort of in cloud environments, it should happen in the vendor environment, but once an algorithm is produced, then the algorithm application is suited for the endpoint. So, you know, train on the vendor's machines, apply the algorithm on your own endpoint. That's a good approach. So as the third and final best practice today, consider the design of your security workload. This is an overhead for your endpoint, a critical one, but an overhead. Ensure machine learning, static sandboxing, other heavier workloads happen elsewhere, preferably in an easily scalable location like the cloud, and save the endpoint for workloads that need to be locally, like algorithmic execution and protection. Ensure the user experience does not force the naive end user to take on the role of a cybersecurity expert. Now, don't quarantine and ask the end user to decide. Instead, ensure an independent verdict is delivered by your vendor or by your cybersecurity expert. As with everything in business, it's a balance of security benefit to benefit cost. So 3 helpful recommendations for you there.